Hi, Ilona. I see you entered. Can we hear you if you turn on the mic and see you?
Yes, hello.
Hi, super.
Greetings to Rijeka. Hello.
Hi, Ilona. Just also a question. Will you share the presentation, or how did you plan? You will share it.
Yes, I would like to.
Okay, super
Let's
great.
try it.
Super.
I cannot because you have to let me share.
I think they will make you co-host when KOLYA and GRACIELA finish. So when you start the presentation, right?
And when is it? When is it? Could you tell me? Because I thought that I will start at 12. When I will start?
So basically, KOLYA's presentation, he said, is a bit longer. I think he said around an hour. We will, if it's
then
possible.
I cannot. It is impossible. That's why we agreed with you that I will be at 12 because I have a presentation here in Budapest, and I have to leave from here 1:30. So, half past one, yes.
Okay. So
I can be the first or second.
Okay.
But cannot stay longer.
I don't know. Shall KOLYA? How? I mean, you're here. Can you tell us if we can be finished?
I'm happy to change order. I can be here all day.
You can be here all day.
So
okay.
If you want to go earlier than me, that's fine.
Would it make sense then to have, in a way, to have Ilona and GRACIELA first? I think I don't know if GRACIELA is here as well. Just to not have to have then the two artistic presentations together, and the context, the wider context that KOLYA is talking about, then at the end, to not have first Ilona, then KOLYA, then GRACIELA. It will make a weird dynamic. Do you think it's okay? I'm asking the people in the Zoom, not the people in the audience.
Yes, I am sorry for that, but I thought that we will start at 12 and I will be the first because I wrote the email about that. So I am very sorry, and
okay.
I will be very glad if I can be in Rijeka, but I have this presentation also in Budapest. So okay. I'm comfortable with all the solutions. If KOLYA or the others, they can accept it.
Okay, 1 second. Do we have?
I'm absolutely fine. Whatever works.
Okay, so I suggest we're waiting for GRACIELA. She's not here, right? Jel GRACIELA slučajno došla?
In which case, let me stop sharing mine.
Okay, so I suggest that we then start with Ilona. If GRACIELA arrives soon, then we continue with GRACIELA, and we have KOLYA as a wrap-up, in a sense, as a wider context. I mean, I think both readings are fine, but just to keep the two artistic presentations together if possible, so we just hope that GRACIELA will arrive. That's here. Okay, there's a dog. Okay, so Ilona, if you can start, then you will get now permission to share your screen. Okay. And then we will be in contact with the technical crew to see if GRACIELA arrives. If GRACIELA arrives, then we will have her second, and otherwise KOLYA can be second, and then GRACIELA will be third. Will that work? Okay. So yeah, okay. Let's wait. Yeah. We said anyway. With Ilona, we didn't communicate this. So we will wait for a couple of more minutes, so 5 to 10 minutes, just to have people gather. It's Saturday, so okay. They're coming.
Okay. So I have, okay, so we have more 10 minutes. You will let me know when can we start.
We will let you know. Don't worry, Elvis will introduce you, and you will take over from there. The idea is to have...
I cannot hear you.
sorry. The idea is that after the introduction you speak, we have one question directed, if there is a specific question for the presenter, and then in your case, actually, since you will be leaving, if there is more questions, we will take more questions at the time, and then the idea is in general to have one question after the presentation and then rest at the end, but maybe it's better this time to have them after each presentation. Okay.
Eva, do you listen to me?
Yes.
And what is the best form of presentation? Do you see me also now?
Yes, we see you and we see your slides.
You see also the picture. Okay.
Yeah, we see
then this is a good picture for you. So you don't see nothing else, just my presentation with the first instant sugar image.
Yes.
I am right?
Yes, you are in the right corner. Okay. We see a little bit like the usual share screen situation with Zoom, so it's perfect.
But sometimes I can hear you, sometimes not. I don't know why, but it is like this.
Aha, zato što me gase, ali nema veze. We started 5 minutes.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the festival Mine, Yours, Ours, with the title this year, Sugar Everywhere. So welcome everyone in the audience and welcome everyone online. For this day, we are having 3 presenters, and due to some organizational changes, I just wanted to say that the order of our presenters has changed. So we will start with the artist Ilona Nemet first, then with the artist Graciela Carnevale, and last with the researcher and archivist KOLYA ABRAMSKY. To say something about our presenters first, just short. Ilona Nemet is an artist, professor, and curator based in Slovakia. Her artistic practice is a search for a balance between personal experience and growing up in a country marked with political turmoil and the universal history of the Eastern Bloc countries during the transitional period of the 90s until now. Her project, Eastern Sugar, first exhibited in Kushale, Bratislava, was a starting point of a research and exhibition, international research and exhibition project of the same name that this exhibition is also a part of. So she initiated in many ways the discussions we're having here. Graciela Carnevale lives and works in Rosario, Argentina. Carnevale organized Acción del Encierro, if I said it right, which is a lock-up action in which individuals attending the opening reception for the exhibition were locked in gallery for more than an hour. Only way to go out of the gallery was by shattering the gallery windows. In '65, she became involved in Grupo de Arte de Vanguardia de Rosario, a group that introduced radical changes in the local art scene, but also internationally. In '68, Carnevale and Arte de Vanguardia de Rosario, together with artists from Buenos Aires, organized Tucuman Arde, or Tucuman Burns in English. In '69, Arte de Vanguardia disbanded. Carnevale returned to the production of art in 1994. And lastly, KOLYA ABRAMSKY is a UK-based freelance archivist. He's a board member of EOGAN, or I'm not sure how to pronounce EOGAN, International Energy Archives Network, and he also worked on different trade union and left-wing archives. He works extensively with international social movements for many years before becoming an archivist. I want to welcome our presenters and welcome Ilona. And Ilona, please take you take on now. Thanks. Ilona, just your mic is not on. You need to turn it on. Your microphone in Zoom, yeah. No, it's red. I see it. It's only if you have to, like, somewhere in Zoom there should be, I think at the bottom, like a mic icon. You need to press. Yeah, down there. I don't see it though.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Do you listen to me now?
Great. Thank you.
But it was the problem that the host muted me. And after that, I was not able to unmute it.
Sorry for that.
But now it's okay.
Great, thanks
okay. Do you see me and also do you listen to me now? Yes. Are you?
Yeah, now we see you and hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Greetings to Rijeka, and I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you. But I had the occasion to listen also yesterday, the evening event, and I'm really glad that you organized this conference. So also Ferenc and also Anton already told some sentences about the Eastern Sugar project, but I think I have to tell you my reasons why I did, or why I started this research. So maybe I will tell you some facts which you already know, but I have to repeat them. So the first image, Eastern Sugar is our artistic research project since 2017. There were two most important motivations to start this project. One of the main components was our changing Middle European identity, full of idealism and hope after 1989. Especially in the 90s, which turned back to the opposite direction because of the economic problems, wide privatization, corruption, political climate changes, lost illusion of the possibility of integration into the Western part of the world. V4 animation was my artistic reaction for the 25th anniversaries of the establishment of the V4 cooperation in 2016. This work represents the changes of dimension of our identification with Europe. Nationalism and populism started to grow in political communication and with the private conversation as well from the end of the 90s gradually. It was necessary to deal with this new situation also in art. I turned my practice toward to the problem of raising nationalism and populism. Since 2010, I co-curated international series of exhibitions and events with the title Private Nationalism in 6 different countries and continued in Vienna and Prague with the series of universal hospitality exhibitions dealing with the nationalism and the hot European tasks. After 7 years spent on the research of nationalism, I continued with research of the possible roots of the problems. I understood that I must think about economic transformation and also the last almost 30 years of history of cooperation and non-cooperation between post-socialist Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the rest of the world. The second component of my motivation to start Eastern Sugar project was that I was born in the town Dunajská Streda, south part of Slovakia. I grew up in the shadow of the sugar factory. In 1990, in Slovakia, we had 10 sugar factories, and the most modern was in my town. The factory was built in 1969. In 1993, Eastern Sugar, British-French company, was formed by Tate & Lye and St. Louis Sucre, and the company bought 38% from the state-owned company and gradually raised the ownership. In 2002, Eastern Sugar became a 100% owner of and renamed the former South Sugar Factory to Eastern Sugar. Our sugar factory was demolished in 2007 based on the agreement between Slovakia and EU and the World Trade Organization about the sugar quotas from the year 2004. As you know, we entered EU in the same year. The British-French Eastern Sugar built a company covering 3 countries, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, which at its peak produced something like 350,000 tons of sugar per year in Central Europe, all closed in 2006. The European Union, pursuant to WTO negotiations, decided to reduce the sugar production from 19 million to 40 million tons per year and to decrease the quotas allocated to individual member states. If any of the member states decided not to produce their sugar quota, they received compensation amounting to 730 euro per ton of sugar. Eastern Sugar took advantage of this possibility and returned the quota of 70,000 tons allocated to Dunajská Streda factory to the European Union and collected 730 euro per ton. The requirements of the European Union was to make sure that once the quota was returned, the given factory would never be put in operation again. That means that it was supposed to be disposed of in such a manner that it must be leveled to the ground, including the liquidation of the underground networks to the depths of 2.5 meters. In 2018, I continued with the research of all working factories in 1989. On the picture, you can see the former famous factory from Slovakia in town Sládkovičovo. my favorite location. From the 10 existing sugar factories in Slovakia in the early 90s, all were transformed from national companies to state enterprises and were offered for privatization. Today, we have 2 factories in our country, one in Austrian Agrana company and one in the German Nordzucker company property. On 1st of October 2017, sugar production and trade quotas were abolished. It means that now we have free sugar trade again. We visited all the former sugar factory sites in Slovakia with photographer KOLYA Stefanovic. We made research on these 10 locations, mapped and archived the sites and their individual narratives. The factory on the slide in Sladkovičovo was founded in 1867 by the Kufner and Gutman families and closed in 1999. In addition to the modernizing and expanding the sugar factory, they improved so-called biocide method for beet growing and animal breeding. In contemporary terminology, no waste economy with strong ecological thinking. Recently, garbage industry is present in the historical buildings. Our storages, the historical monument is saved only in the documents. The next site is Pohronsky Ruskov, founded 1893, closed 100 years later in 1993. Sugar beet is a plant entangled with Central European modern history and economy. Its high concentration of sugar was discovered during the mid-18th century by the Prussian chemists in the quest of finding an equivalent for sugarcane. Boosted by Napoleon's continental blockade, when import of colonial sugar supplies was restricted, the plant provided not only a readily available source for sweetening, but also gave birth to the new industry branch. For agricultural reasons, such as the Hungarian kingdom, later Austro-Hungarian monarchy, sugar production even became an engine of belated industrialization from the second half of the 19th century onwards. A large sugar beet plantations and several sugar factories were established in the territory of present-day Western Slovakia, where the owners contributed to the region's development not only economically but also through supporting education and culture. Overshadowed by the century of wars and socialist centralization, the factories still operate after 1989 were gradually integrated into the global capitalism. In 2006, many of them fell victim to the liberalization of the European sugar market, during which most sugar factories have been dismantled and farmers changed their crops. The history of the sugar industry in Central Europe thus relates to skillful and indifferent factory owners, altering state interests and economic policies as well as the workers exposed to these changes. In the Eastern Sugar Project, sugar became a symbol for both growth and decay, providing a new angle from which Central European history can be discussed. Another example is Surani, where the sugar factory was founded in 1852, closed in 2000. The photo was made in the 50s after the Second World War, when the factory was on the top of the daily production of sugar. Today, demolished buildings are used for storage. On the picture for the wooden chips. Uniform consumerism is replacing the production in Rimavská Sobota, the middle part of Slovakia as well. Factory was built during the socialism in 1960 and partly demolished in 2005. Our location shopping mall areas recently. This is a map of the Eastern Sugar Project, which was presented also by Ferenc yesterday, presented in Kunsthalle Bratislava in larger scale. In cooperation with architects, photographers, researchers, the exhibition consists of following parts: archive, sugar loaf manufacture, museum of sugar, and international part of the guest office. We planned and realized the installation archive together with architect Marian Revas and photographer Olja Stefanovic, and the video part with Cukru production Martina Slovakova. We made this research on these 10 former sugar factory sites together. We met local experts, former workers. We mapped and archived the sites and their individual narratives. And this is another map from today morning when I draw it, because it is the map of the Eastern Sugar 0.2 project. There is visible how our research grows from my individual interest into the horizontal network of partners. Now we are some kind of cooperative, trying to integrate different fields of interest. So you can see that in the first, I started with my research, and then it grows to the 0.1 Eastern Sugar project with 6 partners. The Rotor, Anton, and Margareta are there. Futura from Prague, Futura Gallery, the Slovak National Gallery, and Gonzala Bratislava, Ferenc, like ENSA, the university, Budapest Institute of Research of Education, TTUDOK, and Europäische Kunsthaus-Freising with Eikeberg. And now we decided, after our 6 exhibitions and producing also the book Eastern Sugar, we decided to continue, and we are now 10 of us. Except the mentioned ones from Rijeka, the MMS Museum. And then the City Gallery will be our leader for the project, and Trafo from Budapest, and we have new French partners. I don't know how to pronounce the Tanneries from Emily, and MBK, the Neuberliner Kreuzfreiheit from Berlin, and we have a civic association, the Pomvangi, who would like to build up the Museum of Sugar, and we have the Czech University from Ústí nad Labem. It is important to show this map, because I think this was the main, so it is the main success of the whole project, that we can continue with the research from the different countries, from different perspectives, and it is really a horizontal structure where all the topics which are important for the partners, they will be part of the whole research. So the next picture you see already, because it is the archive which was exhibited also in 3 locations. But I have to tell you something about this. So it is the picture part, our photo archive. And also the video part of the archive now consists from 15 videos. Some of them, they are also now exhibited in Rijeka. And the videos presented earlier, the amount of the videos is growing, and I will make an exhibition now in Trafo Gallery in Budapest, where we will present just the video part of the archive. On the picture, there is Dusan Janicek. He is one of the experts which we made. He is from the field of the sugar industry, and still one of the directors of the Szered Sugar Factory, which is in Austrian property, and who last 30 years works in the industry in different positions. He talked about the transformation process of the industry from the 90s in his video talk, from this Eastern European perspective. The other expert who we also interviewed is Christian Lauer, expert from France, worked from the late 80s for the Tetelai British company. He was sent to he told us that he was sent to the region to make research of the possibilities of the cooperation for his company. He came immediately after the changes in 1993, and the Eastern Sugar British-French company was formed by Tetelai and Saint Louis Sucre, as I told you, in the same year. In the 90s, they gradually owned sugar factories in their 4 countries. He provides his so-called global perspective on the same story or history. As you see, the visitors in the installation archive could participate in setting up archive photos in different ways. Part of the archive, except the photos and the videos, is also the reinstallation of the original piece of linoleum flooring with the logo of the Juhocukor, later Eastern Sugar, Factory Dunajska Streda from the 90s. The linoleum was placed in the former workers' entrance. Today, this entrance building remained from the factory after the demolition. Crucial part of the exhibition was the working manufacture with 4 employees. Sugarloaf manufacturer with 33 working stations worked 7 days a week. The main room of the Kunsthalle gallery was rebuilt for this occasion as a part of my project. Employees worked 4 hours, a 5-day every week. We found them in a cooperation with local labor and unemployed office. There were many applicants. I interviewed everybody. We chose workers with sugar industry backgrounds for the manufacturer. It was an experiment also in that way, how to provide proper working conditions for employees and how to integrate one small functioning manufacturer into the structure of the exhibition in the gallery. This picture was made in Freising at the gallery of Europäische Klosterhaus. This is the reinstallation, or the only reinstallation of the manufacturer in different environments. The workers produced sugar loaves, or the traditional form of sugar products still used for special reasons, for example in Germany, where it was reinstalled. The visitors could participate in the process. They could experience the joy of manual work. The cooperation of our employees and the visitors worked very well in Slovakia, but in Germany it was much more difficult. Visitors could take half amount of their production, which they made on the site. Mediators of the gallery and employees show the process to the visitors. As you know, I just repeat that the sugar loaf was the usual form in which sugar was produced and sold until the late 19th century and early 20th century. When granulated and cubed sugar were invented in Rijeka in 1843 in the Czech Republic by Jakob Christoph Raab. A tall cone with the rounded top was the product of the process in which dark molasses was refined into the white sugar. We designed our own package. Our employees and guests packed the products together. As an important independent part of the project, we founded and opened the Museum of Sugar, as Anton told also yesterday, a pilot project of the fictive museum in cooperation with museologist Miroslav Elias from the local municipal museum in Šurany, in one of the small towns of Slovakia where sugar factory was for centuries. The presentation at Kunsthalle assembles various elements of the planned institution, including several objects, models, historical painting, and photo documentation, all based on extensive archival research. On the picture, you can see the detail from the museum exposition with the model of the sugar factory, which I already showed you in the previous images. The visitors of the exhibition had possibility to visit the Eastern Sugar exhibition from 2 different entrances and perspectives. They could enter the site through the archive part of the exhibition representing the recent situation, or through the Museum of Sugar representing the historical perspective. Our civic association, called Museum of Sugar, was established last year with Dusan Janicek, expert of the sugar industry. We are working now on the founding of the Real Museum in cooperation with students of the architecture of urbanism from the Slovak Technical University in Bratislava. Maybe in 2 years we will have such an interesting exposition in Slovakia, as you already have in Rijeka, which I had the occasion to visit last year. Our book, edited by Maja and Ruben Fox and me, was published in cooperation with the Slovak National Gallery and Sternberg Press Berlin in January 2021. This is an image, last image of the book, and through critical text, conversation, and artistic interventions, the book Eastern Sugar restores complexity of the history of the rapid decline of the Slovak sugar industry, and by extension, the wider social and economic infrastructures of the transition in Central Europe. And this is a image, the last image of my presentation, because it is a map of Ferenc Group, which was presented by Ferenc yesterday, and I think this is the best image to give to continue with the other presentations. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ilona, for your presentation. If there are questions from the audience, this would be a nice moment.
Thank you very much, Ilona, for your presentation. And I'd like to just ask one question about your recent future, which will, the project that you will work on right now. The last big exhibition of this first big Eastern Sugar project was in Kunsthalle Bratislava, Potential Agrarianism. And as I understood, your project that you are developing for Documenta, it had some links with that. So, but with other projects of you, of course. But if you can tell us a little bit about this new project that you are developing, this garden.
Thank you, Franz, for the question. Yes, it is a quite interesting in that way that the work which was invited to Documenta 15 for this year, they are the floating gardens, so-called floating gardens, 2 islands which I designed with my colleagues 10 years ago for one exhibition in Budapest for the Art on Lake project. And then that time, it was really 11 years ago, the goal was to think about somehow the islands as a possible controlled place for the human beings. Like, we are making gardens to have a safe place. And that was the main issue in which I was interested 10 years ago. But now, when the work was invited, I had the feeling that we lost all this control. We are absolutely in another situation, and the gardens, to make islands, we lost also the illusion of control. And that's why we are now doing, and also with this experience of Eastern Sugar for some years, and also the ecology of growing the crops and the all knowledge what we collected, all of us together, it changed my mind about also the gardens and about the plants as such. So now we are using the same platforms like islands, floating islands. We will install them in Castle, but the first garden, the one garden, will be dedicated to the healing. So it means that we will plant there plants who are helping each other in existence, and they are also helping to the people, and the people, they are helping to the plants. So it is some kind of still illusion, but it is more about the cooperation, the healing garden. And the second garden will be the garden of the future, in cooperation with the Kassel University, because the experts from the Kassel University, they are on their campus, they like to grow different plants from the so-called future, the plants which are now in the air, and they are starting to grow in the campus without any help. And we will replace the 12 square meters as my island sizes. We will replace the 12 square meters, and we try to continue the garden with the plants which can help to the soil to be more healthy, because the campus is on the area where there was a fabric for the colors, and there are different contaminations into the soil. So we would like to make a future garden based on this idea. I know that it was a little bit too long, but the whole project is quite complex, and I was not able to tell it in 2 sentences. Sorry for that.
Thank you for your answer. Is there any more questions? Eva?
Maybe as a comment, for me it was really interesting getting to know about your research, and somehow I had a a comparative feeling when we look at the situation that is happening in Eastern Europe now and in Croatia also, because two of the three factories, sugar factories, have closed after the end of protection within Europe on sugar industry. And in a sense, I had a feeling of a similar situation to in the media, because then I was listening also to the media reports on how they react to how the narrative goes within Croatia in this relation, and it opens up kind of antagonisms towards outside of Europe, because when the protections fell, then the outside became the threat. So for me, Ferenc is actually, his work with Domier's graphic very much resonated with this, because you're also saying at some in the book, in some sense, that the factories that were closer to Central Europe stayed. The factories in Eastern Europe are closing, but then there is this threat from these factories that are outside of Europe.
Yes, you know, it's so that's why that's why it's this whole research, because if we can have very easy answers to the complexity, then if we can have very easy answers, then the research is done already, or the situation is better. I think this is the some kind of sinusoid moving in the trade also with the sugar and with the sugar industry. So, you know, a lot of people, they were happy that the quotas were over, but it means for us and also for the region and for the whole sugar industry in Middle Europe that the sugar became so cheap that the factories, they will be closed again because of the price. But I think now we are in the completely different situation because of the Ukrainian war, and it could be much worse in some months. So I don't want to tell that I am very pessimistic, because I am always an optimistic person, but I think that we have now much worse problems as we had some months ago in the economy. But the worst is, in my point of view, that we will focus ourselves, all our culture will focus on the guns and not on the ecological issues. So we are somehow in the moment when it could turn everything to the really bad scenario. So this is my comment to your comment.
Thank you, Ilona. So this is the last moment for any additional questions that might be here. Are there any questions that come online, maybe? No. Okay, if this is it, I would say then we close your presentation for now. And Graciela, I see you in the Zoom. In the beginning, you were not here yet. We mentioned that, sorry, I'm turning around. We mentioned that the order of presentations has changed a little bit. And so if you agree, we would like you to present now. Is this fine, Graciela? Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for coming. Yeah, I have introduced you in the beginning of the session, so I will not repeat this again, but everyone welcome Graciela, and you take your, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes? May I begin?
Yeah, we see you and hear you. You can start.
Sorry?
I just confirmed that we hear you and see you, so you're free to start. Do you want to share your presentation on the screen?
No, I'm going to share a PowerPoint.
Yeah,
but not in, well, I can...
Okay, the technicians...
First.
Yeah. Wait just a second, the technicians will invite you to share the presentation. You can now share the PowerPoint.
I think I'm going to share a bit afterwards.
You want to share it afterwards, the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Because there is a button on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. There should be a button that says share, and you should be able to do it there. It's a green button, and yeah, this one. So if you press this, you should be able to share. Yeah, I know. No. If you wish to start without presenting, without the PowerPoint, you're also free to do it like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Well, I want to thank Frank for the invitation that gives me the opportunity to share an experience with certain parallelism with Ilona's Sugar of the East project. I will speak from my own experience, from those practices that in some way were constituted in training spaces, giving rise to processes of self-determination that allowed us to think of artistic practice as a disruptive action on reality. I would like to start by referring to Tucumanale, Tucuman is burning, and to the avant-garde artist group, which I belong to that in the 60s, in the hostile and repressive context of a military dictatorship regime, questioned the role of the artist at the moment when radical ideas traveled the world and installed the utopia of the possibility of a revolution. In those times, our practices and productions entered into contradiction and conflict with our convictions, and forced us to think of the artist as an agent of change immersed in the conflicts of society, and art as a tool of social transformation. For this, it was necessary to define new concepts and imagine new strategies and formats, new materials, and look for other spaces and other audiences to address, leaving aside a contemplative conception of art in order to insert our doing in everyday life into the search for new ways of living. The group of avant-garde from Rosario, Argentina was born from certain critical positions related to art and the search out of new languages and materials, considering that traditional resources were obsolete and useless in the society we were living in. I'm referring to an experience that took place more than 50 years ago, and to the process of radicalization and political compromise of a collective of artists that tried to explore other definitions of art and other roles for the artist. The relation between subject and context, between imagination and creative process in hostile backgrounds raises questions, provokes actions that oppose the status quo. In the process of this research, our productions transformed themselves, and at the same time we were transformed. This reconstruction of ourselves from art practice took place in a group and made us realize that we could get rid of museums and art institutions and can assume the organization and production of our work in order to install it in other social contexts, conceiving reception as a collective participation instance and artistic practice as a political practice. Tucuman Arte was a collective and interdisciplinary work where multiple collaborators made possible its realization. It was conceived as a denounce and action of counterinformation in mass communication to make known the real social situation in Tucuman produced by the closure of the sugar mills due to the economic policies implemented by the military government that was in power. Tucuman sought to bring the social conditions of the province to the attention of a large public, putting into perspective the fact that a big amount of the population were drowned to poverty and starvation. Tucuman Arte's aim was to denounce the policies of a totalitarian government by means of images, texts, and reports, a project on the social crisis that was taking place in the region. We conceived production at that time from field investigation and denounced a social reality through a documented registration which involves the public in an aesthetic experience, appealing to all its senses, exploring the use of new languages in the search of new associations in the political field. We strove not only to inform, we did not appeal exclusively to the brain. We wanted to provoke a sensory experience that could produce knowledge. For that, we needed to break free from institutionalized forms, from legitimated places, imposed canons, and to risk some new paths on which to embark. It manifests a resistance to values imposed by a dictatorship regime, thinking of art and the role of the artist as a disruptive action tending to influence society in order to accompany the process of transformation that we perceived as possible. What we called as artistic was far from being recognized as such in the institutional circuit of the time. The aspects that make this proposal relevant were the strategies used, the experimental attitude in the work, and the critical stance towards arts institutions and the political context. In the dictatorial processes that took place in those years in Latin America, it is the repressive and violent context that gives meaning to our production. The artistic praxis is then understood as the possibility of developing new concepts, ideas, representations that extend beyond the field of art to explore other territories, particularly in artistic practice and political practice. We decided our insertion in the political struggle by assuming as mobile of our work are one of the points of the activist program of the CGT, the General Confederation of the Workers, that agglutinated the most radicalized sectors of the workers' movement. This deterritorialization of artistic practice implied a new concept for the artwork, the need to think about research as part of it, the establishment of new spaces, the constructions of new audiences, and the insertion in other types of institutions. Tucuman Art represents a highly disruptive innovations combining a whole range of artistic and political strategies not in use in art practice in those times. The aim was to shed light on the social consequences of political and economic military policies. It intended to explore possibilities of broadening the field and practice of art, and to reflect on the impact those changes had in our country, related them to the global map of capitalist production and globalization. We imagine a complex and ambitious project that developed over time on several stages and in different territories. I'm going to try to share the screen now.
Thanks. It's working. We see it. But we see your desktop, not the application.
No, it's not that.
Okay.
Sorry. Oh.
After you press the button Share Screen, you should have options what to share. Like which screen, which program.
Now.
Now it works. Now we see the PowerPoint.
Okay. I'm going to show some images from the different stages that we thought this wait for me.
I think if you, in the low right part of the screen, there are a couple of icons. And I think if you click on the one that is very close to this plus minus, this, how do I say it? Like next to the scroll bar, there is an icon. If you press this, it should go full screen. And then you can have a presentation. Like low right part of the screen.
Yes. This we thought that this.
Now go down.
Sorry.
So your. Oh yeah, maybe you can show like this. Yeah. Yeah.
We saw the very. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying if you go with your mouse down next to where the scroll is, this plus minus symbols, there is icon for full screen. Then you can show it like this. But if you want to go with scroll, it's also okay.
Okay. This. We really thought of a very ambitious project to make this denounced in trying to use mass media also, because this, the real situation that was going in Tucumán was not known by the rest of the country. Tucumán is 800 kilometers from Rosario, and so we decided to make this put into the knowledge of the public. So we divided the project in 4 steps. The first, we began with research about what was happening there, what was happening in sugarcane industry, and what was happening with the population there, because sugarcane industry was the main resource work in Tucumán at the moment. So we decided to make first this kind of research to know about it, and then we began with a kind of publicity campaign, we call it like that. We made this kind of sticker that was put it everywhere in Rosario. Then the first stage of this campaign was the presentation of this poster with the only word Tucumán all around Rosario, in order to make it like a kind of publicity campaign, but like an informative publicity campaign. Yeah, in one of the faculties in the university, they are setting up a poster. This was at the very beginning of this kind of work we were doing that was took place in different moments and in different places. The second part of the publicity campaign consisted in graffitis that were produced clandestine by students in the university. They were done by night. And these graffitis were produced while the part of the group of artists were in Tucumán trying to produce the register. And the third part, this was also a ticket for the cinema, where you see the Tucumán art also written there. The third part was this poster, first biennial of avant-garde, that was set up in publicity places when the exhibition was taking place in Rosario. This, calling this first Biennale of avant-garde art, was thought like that in order to make a kind of camouflage of the real intentions of the work. And it was like putting back this action or this project into the art field. And this is the facade of the CGT quarter in Rosario, where the exhibition took place. here I am going to show some photographs and some of the photos that were taken by the group that went to Tucumán on about how the workers' conditions were, how the hard work was all produced by human force. There were no mechanized form of doing the crops. So you see here the whole family working for the crop, for the safra. The workers were came from different parts of the country and were like temporary workers. Children also work. And their conditions were really deplorable. Very precarious. They lived in very precarious houses. Sorry. And the situation was really, they were really in poverty and starvation because the government decided to close up 11 of the 27 sugar factories that were in Tucumán. All this material, we send it to the other part of the group that stay in Rosario in order to prepare the exhibition that took place at the General Quarter of the Central Confederation workers. And here you can see one of the strategies used in the setup of the exhibition. This is at the entrance of the house, where this kind of diagram shows the relations of the owners of the mills with other mills, and also the relations with politics, because here one of the walls there were Leon Ferrari, that was one of the artists that was from part of the group. For a year, he tried to collect all the articles that were in the press that saying about what was happening in Tucumán. And we project diapos and also films. And at the same time, in during the 10 days that the exhibition lasted, we made interviews to different activists and syndicalists and tried to produce a kind of political act during the exhibition. You see the big photograph enlargements on the walls and the big quantity of public was there. Coffee was offered without sugar, and also food was asked for the public to bring in order to take this to Tucumán. Statistics were shown about children died for starvation at that moment. And also denunciations of that the new industries that the government said they were started by very few workers. We also showed what we call frontarios, that was like a diagram about the relations of the owners of the sugar mills with political power and economic power too. And this was the entrance of the show, and the final diapo is an image, is the image of the text and research done by sociologists about the situation in Tucumán. And we see here a girl eating sugar cane. I leave here the presentation and go back to my text.
If you can turn your camera back on, because now we don't see you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Graciela, are you continuing with your presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
The intention of the exhibitions was to place in different places, in different cities, in the Central Union Workers quarters. But, and the first exhibition took place in Rosario and lasted 10 days. In Buenos Aires, closing of the exhibition in the opening day in the city of Buenos Aires due to censorship quickly closed this newly initiated path and put in crisis the assumptions that sustain our imaginary of work and political commitment with the working class. From here, we could not find alternative answers to this newly open road, a situation that led to the abandonment of art and the dissolution of the group. Different political and ideological points of view arose. Rooting in the most radical labor unions was no longer possible. The group broke. A long time afterwards, we stopped our artistic production to commit ourselves to different political activities. After the first moment of stability in the 70s, Tucumanarde was silenced during the second military coup, and it's only with the advent of democracy in 1984 that it begins to be recovered. Once again, it took pause and visibility towards the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, with the generalized crisis in Argentina, when the border situation that was going through the country updates similar concerns to those of the 60s, and many activist groups took Tucumanarde as a reference of their actions. Those closed mills are the significant ruins of an era, are witnesses to the decadence of a form of production that is totally outdated in global capitalism, replaced by a more mechanized and less labor-intensive type of production. In the 70s, one of the sugar factories, the Santa Lucia, was converted into a military base and clandestine detention center during independence operation, with the aim of the annihilation of all those opposed to the military regime. Men and women were tortured, murdered, and disappeared in this place. Recently, Diego Arauz, an anthropologist and artist from Tucumán, organized an exhibition in relation to the 2000 years of the sugar industry in Tucumán, where Tucumán Arde was also included. The sugar industry developed in Tucumán during the first half of the 19th century, between the sugar industry developed in Tucumán during the first half of the 19th century was developed in Tucumán during the first half of the 19th century. Between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the sugar activity was consolidated as the most important productive structure of the province. With the expansion of the area under sugarcane production, the province became the main sugar producer in the country. Sugar became the province's main production, a monoculture subjected to the vagaries of the market. On the other hand, the expansion of sugar business in Tucumán redefined economic, social, and political relations and popular distributions in the province. The activity that required an intensive seasonal use of labor, especially in agricultural tasks, showed a high concentration of workers per sugar mill. The living conditions of the sugar workers were deplorable, little lower quality food, precarious housing, and low wages, part of which was paid in vouchers, only accepted as the mill's suppliers, making the work of women and children an almost unavoidable requirement. The productive structure of Tucumán underwent changes of great importance during that period. The passage from a work-intensive industrialization based on the substitution of imports to capital-intensive one with predominance of the most efficient and larger companies implied that both the agricultural activity and the manufacturing sector of the province lost importance. Since 1955, the sugar industry developed its activity within a frame of growing deregulation policies, which resulted in a deep deterioration by the end of the 70s and 60s, with the closure of the 11 of the 25 sugar refineries, making monoproduction profitable for the most powerful companies, strengthening monopoly capital, favoring concentration, limiting sources of work, trying to destroy union organizations, increasing unemployment, lowering wages, liquidating small producers in areas that are not central to the government's economic plan, thus placing a small peripheral province in the circuit of global neoliberal politics and making it an accomplice in the processes of industrial production. We cannot speak of slave work in Tucuman, but we can assert the precarity of workers' conditions in sugar plantations, provides a diagram of unimaginable mystery. Unknown to us in Rosario, an exceptional wealth of the owners and eccentricity of cultural programs sponsored by them. Nowadays, sugar production from sugarcane is no longer the principal industry in Tucuman.
Graciela, I just wanted to ask, how long is your presentation reaching? Are you close to the end? Because we are running a bit over time.
Okay, yes. I'm just finishing.
Okay, super, great. Thank you.
I think it is not possible to understand Tucumanarde and the sugar problem outside of the context of wider politics of anti-capitalist liberation structures which developed in the 20th centuries in our countries. These presentations aim to focus on the political of sugar within the military government. Tucumanarde puts Tucuman in relation with the history of extractivism and liberal global markets and art production that expressly deals with social, political, economical, and ecological issues of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Graciela, for your presentation, and thank you also for joining us so early. Thank you very much for that as well. I want to invite someone from the audience now for questions. Yeah, Ferenc?
Hi, Graciela. So thanks again for being with us today and to let us show your Tucumanarde archives. And it's not really a question; it's really more like a comment. And I think that today, especially in these during these hard times, I think it's a great example for younger generations, for everyone. This work that you did with your comrades, with your friends, and and thanks a lot for your generosity. Yeah.
I would also like to thank you very much for all this, to share with us all what you experienced at that time. You mentioned at the very beginning there was a big research, and you said it was a collective action in an interdisciplinary context. May I ask you to specify a little bit, as I understood you come also more from the visual art side, this interdisciplinarity explained. Could you specify or a little bit more on that group, on this big first research group you established at that time? Thank you.
Yes. Sorry if my English is not so good and I cannot express very well, but this was a group. We began as a group because we share similar attitudes on regarding our creations, our works, and because we were not no. Do you see me?
No, we see your computer, but not you.
Yes, that's why.
Okay. And now start the camera.
Now.
Yeah, now we see you. Great.
Oh, yes?
Yes, we see you.
And we were at the beginning we wanted to be known as artists and known our works that were like we were beginning to explore new ways of doing and organized a kind of cycle. We call it experimental art cycle, looking for new forms, new formats, new materials, new ways of producing, because we thought that at that moment we were living at that moment in this dictatorial regime. We need another tools to think art in a different way. And so we, as I said before, we became in contradictions between what we thought and what we were doing. So we realized that we have to address we have to produce, but in not like isolated artists, but really rooted in society. And that's why we decided to work with the Central Union workers. And we began to work with not only with artists, but with writers and a group of sociologists, and also became in contact with the Central Union workers, and this is why we thought we have to expand the art field not only for visual artists, but even in the group and in Tucumán, the group was formed also by non-artists that wanted to be part of this project. And it was like a need to broaden this field and to put art not only in or closed in an art field, but expanded it in everything in life. And that's why it was like, for us, it was like living and making art like an aesthetic experience.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to have to be, but if there is no more questions, maybe we can close for now and thank Graciela again. I'm turning around all the time. Thank you again for your presentation, And we now should switch to KOLYA. KOLYA, are you with us?
Yes, hello.
Yeah. Okay, so if you are ready, you can now take over. Thanks.
Okay, so hello and thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm very sorry not to be there in person. I got COVID a few days ago, so I couldn't travel. I've been looking forward to coming. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the dialectics of sugar in the 20th century. This is a slightly experimental approach. I'm not myself a sugar specialist. In my work, I've never worked explicitly on sugar. I've never walked through a door marked sugar. However, I realized that over 25 years, I've sort of accidentally approached the question of sugar through a variety of different unmarked doors. I've done this as an archivist, as an energy activist, and as a researcher, as a trade activist, as someone interested in left-wing politics, and as a student. Perhaps my approach is a bit broad and eclectic rather than specialist. I nonetheless hope to offer some insights. I'd also like to, at this stage, apologize for not having any images. The images over the last 2 days have been really fantastic to see, really interesting and very aesthetic. I'm afraid I don't have any of them. Anyway, so as an archivist at the George Padmore Institute between 2019 and 21, I was cataloging a collection relating to the Trinidadian Oil Workers Trade Union. This also contains some records of Trinidad's Sugar Workers Trade Union and the wider politics of sugar in the country. At the Commonwealth Secretariat, I worked on records relating to the new international economic order, especially relating to aspects around commodities. Again, this included sugar. Through energy work, I came in contact with the question on bioethanol fuel, participating in a international fact-finding mission on the social and ecological impacts of biofuels in Colombia, organizing publications and events that also treated the question of sugar in relation to energy. And then working on the question of minerals with a South African organization called the Alternative Information Development Center, I read widely on the question of the global politics of primary commodities in the 1970s and 1980s. Again, this touched on the question of sugar. I'd also had experience working on questions of trade and resisting the World Trade Organization. And one of these aspects was agricultural commodities, so again, sugar. Looking as a left-wing activist at the general history of Cuba and the Soviet Union and Comecon also touched on sugar. So all of these sort of led me to put this question together. Sugar is well known as a commodity crop that develops in close relationship with imperialism and colonialism, inter-imperialist rivalry, and its reliance on brutalizing racialized labor forms, namely enslaved and bonded labor. However, less well known and conceptualized is the politics of sugar within the world economy during the 20th century, and especially the second half of the century. During this period, sugar increasingly became a site of struggle and a site of potential liberation. As a weapon, it has been wielded in turn by both sides of the antagonistic class struggle, with at moments capital gaining the upper hand, and at other moments labor gaining the upper hand, with each attempting to resist and subvert the other. The phrase dialectics of sugar expresses the idea that sugar is neither bad nor good, but is contradictory. The ends to which sugar is put are shaped by and in turn shape the wider class relations and world trade relations that it is part of. So these quotations sort of give an idea of the actual dialectic in action. The history of sugar in British Guyana is the history of a struggle by Africans, Indians, Portuguese, and Chinese to resist naked exploitation and to extract the necessities of life from uncompromising and near inhuman profit seekers. Or sugar's history has been the most violent contrast. On the one hand, for centuries, sugar was synonymous with the most brutal exploitation and slavery. Vast fortunes were made. Indeed, much of the primitive accumulation which lay behind the crucial early industrial progress of Great Britain derived directly from the triangular trade in slaves. And yet, during the last 25 years, sugar has come to play a crucial role in providing employment on a vast scale, a wide range of industrial and agricultural skills, as well as large and stable quantities of foreign exchange, which have acted as a great spur to the development effort of many poor countries. There was, throughout the West Indies, a determination to achieve a new order of things and to refuse any return to the old order. The sugar industry had long been a leading example of colonial evil. It could be the starting point for a better future. Or, going to Cuba, the dialectic in action comes through in these quotes. I thought the sun in the cane field as an enemy, a Yankee agent, but Major Raul Castro explained that the sun is very hot and strong, but it's our sun. Or in the battle of 10 million tons, which Ferenc mentioned yesterday, we know that the battle for the 10 million has been lost, or has it? Certainly the target of 10 million tons of sugar by the end of July will not be reached. It is probable that 9 is the most likely figure, in itself a formidable achievement. But there was a political and psychological significance in the battle. On February the 9th, Fidel said, there is no doubt about it. We are determined not to lose this battle. And that is important. We are defending the country's honor, prestige, security, self-confidence. The international significance is that a small, underdeveloped nation has thrown off the yoke of imperialist domination, and the achievements of the 10 million ton sugar harvest is a decisive defeat from United States imperialism. It is a fitting call to the Latin American people and the people of Africa and Asia. So with this presentation, I aim to discuss the sugar within the wider landscape of global commodities, including both global dynamics and dynamics in specific sugar-producing countries. Explore historical developments, landmark events and processes, and trace their interrelationships. I will also trace how commodity-producing countries began to assert their collective and individual power in the world economy, and in turn, how commodity-consuming countries and capital within these countries resisted. I will explore how the balance of forces changed, first in favor of producing countries and then against them, and focus on the relationships, power and change, and the concepts for thinking about this, rather than the highly technical minutiae of trade agreements for sugar export and import quotas, world sugar markets, or prices. I'll mainly draw on political material from the 1930s, 50s, 70s, and 80s, and early 2000s, and this includes having done archival research. So the focus will be on historical periods of struggle. In particular, I highlight periods of struggle for radical social, political, and economic change, which are now largely forgotten about, but urgently need recalling. On the one hand, the question of the importance of the existence of the socialist bloc and attempts to build an international socialist division of labour. On the other, the 1970s as a key period in which international struggles added vitality to the United Nations institutions, making them both the site of radical politics and also intense internal conflict. International commodity politics in the 1970s developed mainly within the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD, and the initiative to build a new international economic order. This took place in the wider context of a range of landmark UN-sponsored progressive initiatives, which included the 6th and 7th special sessions of the UN General Assembly in 1974 and 75 on raw materials and international economic cooperation, struggles for a new world information and communication order within UNESCO, the World Health Organization's 1978 Alma-Ata Declaration on Primary Healthcare, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization's 1975 Lima Declaration on Industrial Development and Cooperation. At the same time, there were important national level class struggles that both reflected and shaped these wider struggles. I'd just like to say my focus is more historical. I have not really gone beyond the early 2000s and not kept up with the current situation, and also have not explored the question of China, which is now the world's biggest sugar importer, and obviously this has major implications. What I hope, though, is that my presentation gives some historical context for thinking about these current questions. So the scope of the presentation: looking at stabilizing and equalizing the world economy and commodity following World War II and the development of international sugar agreements. There was a failed attempt to establish an international trade organization to regulate commodity markets, and international and special sugar agreements developed later. The question of the role of sugar in socialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-fascism, with a look at the Soviet Union, the question of sugar in Cuba's revolution, and the Soviet-Cuban and wider Comecon sugar trade agreements as part of a world socialist system. Also the question of resisting neocolonialism, the efforts of the newly independent countries to build a new international economic order, which centered around attempts to regulate and support global commodities and industrial processing of primary commodities. The emerging worker and trade union struggles in sugarcane agriculture as part of a wider struggle against neo-colonial relations in these newly independent countries. And then finally, the question of, from the 1980s, the capitalist fightback and restructuring of capital to roll back these gains using neoliberalism to weaken the different institutions and processes that had developed previously. I visited 3 different archives: the George Padmore Institute, which is an archive and library of Black, Caribbean, and African and Asian descent in Britain and Europe. It's London-based. The Marx Memorial Library and Workers' Schools, and the Commonwealth Secretariat. So efforts to regulate the global sugar trade are actually very old. They start in 1864 with a failed attempt in Paris. There was another attempt in 1902, a Brussels Sugar Convention. In the 1930s, the World Depression meant commodity prices declined, and there were international efforts to stabilize prices in several commodities: tea, rubber, sugar, wheat, and tin. But these early agreements effectively collapsed in the World War period, and after the war, only agreements for sugar, wheat, and tin resurrected. As part of the wider design of the post-war global economic architecture, the regulation of international commodity once again became a subject of intense discussion. When the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were created, there was also a proposal from the economist Keynes to establish an international commodities bank to provide stability for commodity markets and prices, and an attempt in the Havana Charter to establish an international trade organization. But this was vetoed by the USA and didn't actually happen. With regard to sugar, prior to the World War II, fluctuating prices and then price collapses plunged cane-producing countries into lengthy crisis. Following the war, a range of international regulation and bilateral special arrangements developed to attempt to solve these problems. So there was a very significant global conference in 1956 of the United Nations. It took more than a month of negotiating in 2 different sessions. And this followed on from an initial 1953 international sugar agreement. There was general agreement that this, general sort of consensus among participants at the UN conference, that this was a broadly positive agreement and had an impact in stabilizing world prices, but needed continuing and expanding on. In particular, it needed bringing in key importing countries such as Indonesia, Peru, and Brazil that had not been part of the 1953 agreement. The UN conference addressed a number of wide-ranging issues, including the international measures around specific questions of sugar, the definition of sugar in terms of beet and cane, price arrangements, legal aspects, adjustment of production in importing countries, and promoting sugar consumption, price range and quota mechanisms, how to gather statistics around sugar, and also the question of new uses of sugar. The representatives and advisors came both from sugar importing and sugar exporting countries, and included also sugar associations and companies, both private and state, and also sugar workers' trade unions. A big issue was the question of increasing world sugar consumption, and also the question of unequal levels of sacrifice that come about when you have quotas on exports, especially for countries that really depended on sugar exports to get revenue. This effectively curtailed their development efforts. Importantly, this date occurred before the Cuban Revolution, which had a very big impact on the global sugar market, and also just after the signing of the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement in 1951, and the US quota system was also only a few years old. It happened at a time after the Second World War, when there had been big damage to sugar plants in the war, but also when the general living standard improvements after the war led to a major increase in sugar consumption. So I won't go through this fully, but basically the International Sugar Agreement has been developed in different stages since 1937, which is 85 years this year. It had a number of rewrites, but its basic goal was to assure consumers an adequate supply of sugar on the world market at a reasonable price, not to exceed the cost of production, including a reasonable profit of efficient producers. and it established an international sugar council and set quotas for international free trade of sugar. At different points, this agreement lapsed or didn't really hold out against price rises, but basically it's still in existence, and now there is an international sugar organization based in London to oversee the implementation of this agreement. So it's generally been considered that this has kept some kind of stability in the sugar markets globally, but it's also broken down. In the mid-60s, it broke down quite significantly when world sugar prices became depressed, following the lapse of its provisions in '62. Afterwards, another agreement led to stabilization again. At its most interventory, the agreement worked for a system of allocating quotas and, to exporting members and the holding of reserve stocks of sugar to keep the world price within agreed reference points. However, the current agreement lacks economic power and is more focused on information exchange. Although the negotiations have been extremely technical, focusing on prices, quotas, and legal mechanisms, they are actually highly political, and they are battlegrounds between countries with specific interests and the general interests of all the countries together, the question of producer and consumer countries. And consequently, they've taken a long time, they're very conflictual, and there's a lot of horse trading, and also the question of how votes are distributed, depending on the amount of sugar that a country either exports or imports. Alongside this, there have been four major special trading arrangements in sugar in the 20th century. These were essentially regionally defined bilateral arrangements between groups of cane exporters and major importing countries. And they were based on securing sugar supplies for the consumer countries through a guarantee of market access for stable quantities of sugar at predetermined prices. Three of them were closely linked to empires and their colonies, or at least their spheres of influence after decolonization. And one was linked to an attempt to build alternatives to this. So these were the US quota system, the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, Sugar Protocol of the Lomé Convention between the European Economic Community and African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, and a French system with its overseas department, including Réunion, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. I'm not sure if that system had a name or not. And then there was the Cuba-Soviet Comecon trade agreement. Sugar, which was not covered by these preferential agreements, was simply traded globally through the free trade on the world market without any particular protections or special arrangements. So going into these a little bit further, the US sugar quota system was established in '34, but really strengthened in 1948. And it gave preference to suppliers of cane sugars from specific countries, especially Caribbean, such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Central and South America. I think Nicaragua was at different points an important part of that, and also the Philippines. It offered fixed prices and guaranteed amounts of sugar supplied. So these countries developed their sugar industries specifically to serve the US's sugar interests. And actually, they've suffered a lot as the US developed its own sugar industry and moved towards high fructose corn syrup. Importantly, the Cuban Revolution really busted apart the US sugar quota system because the US banned sugar imports from Cuba. So it had to make up its quotas from elsewhere. Meanwhile, Cuba had to find other outlets for its sugar and turn to the socialist countries. The agreement lapsed in '74 and was reintroduced in 1982. With the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, this was established in 1951 as a long-term supply and purchase agreement between Britain and sugar industries of either its empire or former empire, including Australia, British Honduras, East Africa, Fiji, India, Mauritius, Swaziland, and the key West Indies sugar countries. It was also, especially in some of these countries, known informally as an imperialist charter. Prices were negotiated and essentially politically fixed. There were several renegotiations in '65, in '68, '71, and it was seen as a source of strength that it brought together both producer and consumer countries to share, to secure some kind of both stability and price. And it is considered to have brought substantial improvements to several sugar-producing countries, including in relation to wages, housing, education and welfare, and also sugar workers' trade unions, and a shift away from the old plantation system to increasing numbers of small farmers. But it was also a source of internal conflict, the fact that it was produced from consumer countries, but also that it was conflict between consumer countries to secure their supplies. This agreement ceased to exist in 1974 when Britain became part of the European Economic Community and got incorporated into the Lomé Sugar Protocol. These were very conflictual negotiations, pitting British and Commonwealth cane producer and consumer countries and workers within them in direct competition with the European Economic Community beet producers, especially French beet farmers. The Lomé Sugar Protocol was basically some form of protection to cane producers, and in itself was a sort of concession from the agreements of the European Economic Community, and in some way in conflict with the European Common Agricultural Policy, which really defended beet producers. So it was seen as an attack on cane producers. And in many ways was an outcome of struggle between these different conflicting interests. At the same time, it was also considered to offer quite major protection to the cane sugar producing countries. And it was quite strongly defended when Lomé came under threat, both from within the EEC, which had a very ramped up production of beets in the 1970s and 80s, and also from the World Trade Organization formed in 1994, as it was labeled as discriminatory and offering unfair support and subsidies. So to look at sugar, we have to think of it as a commodity in the world economy. And like any commodity in the world economy, it cannot be separated out of the context of wider politics. And in this period, it was the anti-imperialist liberation struggles, the worker peasant struggles in these countries, and either some form of national liberation, socialism, or communism efforts to build them, at any rate. And sugar, as with any commodity, exists within and also creates concrete world divisions of labor, involving specific sugar-producing countries, sugar-consuming countries, sugar owners, sugar workers, sugar associations, sugar financiers, and many other actors. Structural lines of conflict, inequalities of power also included the question of consumer-producer countries, capital versus labor, and cane sugar versus beet sugar. Importantly, the majority of cane-producing countries were the so-called developing countries, while the majority of beet-producing countries were the so-called developed countries. These are just a few examples of countries: Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Cuba, Philippines, Dominican Republic, India, Mauritius. Beet-producing countries: France, USA, Canada, Australia, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia. And key sugar-importing countries, including US, Britain, France, Germany. These are by no means definitive lists, but some of the sort of very major actors. And sugar becomes a weapon in changing hands. So as these struggles intensified, sugar became an emancipatory weapon, first in struggles against colonialism, against neocolonialism, and part of the International Socialist Division of Labour. In turn, these efforts in sugar and other primary commodities were met by efforts from capital to break up the gains of commodity-producing countries, to break down the solidarities built between them, and to pit them in competition with one another. So, these sugar struggles result in a shifting balance of power, and they also pose important dilemmas for post-independence governments. So in many countries, the role of sugar worker struggles was very important in the early stages of anti-colonial struggles. So in the 1930s in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, in Jamaica, and I think other Caribbean countries, you have a very major wave of worker unrest being spearheaded by sugar workers. And this contributes to a process of building national unity. And it also led to the formalization of trade unions, not just in sugar, but also in other sectors. And there was an attempt to break that resistance, including from British trade unions to promote responsible unionism and to blunt the workers' anti-imperialism. So sugar became very central to questions of whether trade unions were for reform purposes or for wider class struggle. Following independence, countries that produce sugarcane had a very big dilemma, whether to reform or abolish the sector. There were many imperatives to abolish the sugar sector because of its history of slavery and colonialism and exploitation. At the same time, it was a central feature of these countries' economies, and there wasn't much they could do about that fact. So basically, all countries opted to reform rather than abolish the sugar sector. Cuba did make a most serious effort to abolish sugar, but also very quickly changed its approach. This quote sort of sums up from Chedi Jagan, a leader of Guyanese independence. The accusation has always been made, and maliciously, that we in the People's Progressive Party want to destroy the sugar industry and pull down the sugar chimney. This never has been, nor will be, the policy of the PPP. However, it must be pointed out that we are thoroughly opposed to the present system, the present organisation of the sugar industry. The reorganisation can take two forms, complete nationalisation or reforms. As a Socialist Party, nationalisation of the sugar industry, and indeed all major industries, is our objective. In the interim, while we are still tied to British imperialism with limited constitutional powers, certain reforms have to be undertaken to break the back of imperialism. Or, the sugar problem cannot be solved in isolation, but in the whole pattern of our advancing democracy with social services and national independence. Following independence, you have sugar actually having a central role in the development strategies of newly independent countries. It was a large employer and a major source of foreign currency from exports. So the efforts to restructure and reform the industries focused very substantially on improving worker welfare, developing higher skills in the workforce, and the use of new techniques aimed at increased efficiency and output. And often they had wider impact throughout society, showing the importance of it as a national sector. This is an area that I've looked into less and I think needs more looking into. But basically, it had a different role, and sugar had a different role in socialist economies than in capitalist economies. The Soviet Union became a very significant producer of beet sugar and importer of cane sugar. Importantly, it was actually Ukraine and Donetsk that were some of the very important beet growing regions. And beet was classified as both a food and an industrial crop. Beet was a very important part of the country's agricultural development, both in terms of its output, technical developments relating to mechanizing harvesting and frost-resistant varieties, and also for use as animal fodder. The Soviet Union claimed to lead the world in production of beets already as early as the 1930s. In the 1960s and 70s, 5-year plans involved state purchase of sugar beets. And by 1960, 9% of all state purchases in agriculture were actually about sugar beets. And the number of combines, mechanized combines, jumped enormously over that 20-year period, 1950s to 1975. It developed a lot of technical expertise on beets with scientific journals and a major research institute in Kiev. Many of the war plants, many of the processing factories were destroyed or damaged in World War II, but at the same time it became a very important food resource sustaining the Soviet war effort. More well known is the question of Cuba. As mentioned, Cuba tried to abolish sugar, but quickly gave up on this and decided it had to be absolutely central to the national economy. Rapidly became the world's top exporter of sugar, and other industries developed around it, including its confectionery, its chemical plants and distilleries, as well as using waste products in relation to fertilizers and fodder, and the electricity sector uses sugar waste. Prior to the revolution, there was surplus labor in the sugar sector, especially because of the seasonal question, but after the revolution, already by 1962, because there was such an expansion, there was a major labor shortage in the sector, needing all kinds of different ways to get labor into the sector, including extensive use of volunteer labor brigades. Land reform enabled small sugar farmers as well as just large plantations. This goes into the question of the 10 million ton harvest a bit further. A decisive battle is being won by the Cuban people, and that is the battle of the 10 million tons of sugar. The political significance of the 10 million ton harvest is a decisive step in strengthening the Cuban economy, a milestone in the formation of a new man and the culmination of a long process of national affirmation. There are 350,000 voluntary workers taking part, which constitutes 90% of the total cane cutters, who answer the call because of their political conscience. The international brigades from the 5 continents reflect the international solidarity of the new man that Comandante Che Guevara inspired. The 10 million ton harvest has been cut purely by hands of those whom the industrialists in the United States called unable to manage their own destiny. These inferior men and women, these people who are averse to all effort, these are the very same people who have proved themselves more than 10 million, but of 11 as well. The 10 million ton sugar harvest signified $1 billion, used almost completely to import machinery and capital goods. What should the harvest be called now? Should it be called the 9, the 8, or the 10 million sugar ton harvest? We should call it the 10 million ton harvest. It will serve as a yardstick to measure what we have done, how far we have advanced, and what we failed to accomplish. I think these quotes show well the sort of contradictory side, but the potential role or the perceived role of sugar in the liberation process. The Soviet-Cuba agreement and Comecon, following the ban of the US imports of Cuban sugar, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, where long-term agreements were set up guaranteeing purchase from Cuba at a higher price. They were long-term trade agreements and credit, but also included economic and scientific and technical cooperation. Similar agreements with different socialist countries. Some of this also involved barter. So Cuba supplied the USSR with sugar, nickel products, tobacco and tobacco products, and the USSR sent Cuba petroleum and petroleum products, rolled iron, non-ferrous metals, mineral fertilizers, farm machinery, equipment, and other industrial goods. Soviet collaboration played an important role in helping to mechanize the sugar sector in Cuba, although later the machines were able to be built in Cuba, which saved currency. But this had a very important material impact on it. Poland also developed important collaborations with Cuba around sugar. Meanwhile, the newly independent countries were on the offensive, both politically and economically. The power of producer countries of vital commodities was increased, so they increased bargaining power as well in the international fora. They saw commodities as key to their future economic development. From the 1960s onwards, and especially the 1970s, commodities became a key global battleground, with producer countries developing solidarities with each other and making collective interventions on the world political economic stage. The most impacting and most well-known example of this was the establishment of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in 1960. However, OPEC opened the way for similar dynamics to emerge in other key primary commodities, such as sugar, tea, coffee, cocoa, rubber, and other agricultural and mineral commodities. The UN Sixth Special Session on Raw Materials in 1974 was a landmark conference. It was called by Algeria. This quote is from Gamani Correa, who was the General Secretary of UNCTAD in this period. He says, "It took place in an atmosphere vastly different to that which prevailed in the earlier life of the United Nations. A new group of countries with considerable economic and financial power had emerged almost overnight on the world economic scene. Its action had shaken the industrialized countries, which had up to then been the arbiters of economic change, virtually immune to whatever the developing countries might do. The political significance of the OPEC action was such that the dividing line at the special session was not between oil importers and oil exporters, but between the developing countries now in pursuit of a new economic order and the developed countries, guardians of the status quo." So a key framework of this was the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. This was established in 1964 as a UN intergovernmental organization specifically to promote the interests of developing states in world trade. Its founding goals were to maximize the trade, investment, and development opportunities of developing countries and assist them in their efforts to integrate into the world economy on an equitable basis. Common inherited condition from colonialism was that many newly independent countries were still dependent on primary commodities, including sugar. So consequently, the commodity issue became central to UNCTAD's work. Commodities dominated the work of this organization, and there was a spate of meetings on the several aspects of the commodity question. From 1965 to 1976, the average number of meetings per year, some of them lasting several weeks on commodity issues in UNCTAD, was around 12. The number rose to 32 in 1977 and 44 in 1978. In the later years, commodity meetings alone accounted for little under 60% of all UNCTAD meetings. This included 5 major meetings on sugar between 1977 and 1984. So you can see the commodities are really central to UNCTAD. And the conflicts around commodities were also central to major breakdowns in UNCTAD negotiations around the 1977 and 1976 UNCTAD meeting. The General Secretary of UNCTAD was a Sri Lankan, Gamani Correa, and a lot is taken in the next bit from work by him. And one of his main advisors on commodities was a Yugoslav economist, Dragoslav Avramovic. A key program of the UNCTAD was the New International Economic Order. This basically emerged from this sort of feeling that newly independent countries had gained their political independence, but still had a subordinate position economically in the world economy. So several precursor events drew up this New International Economic Order. The non-aligned movement in 1975 had a meeting in Senegal on raw materials, which really emphasized the power of producer countries' action, rather than joint action between consumers and producers. This is seen as a very high watermark of the Third World militancy on the commodity issue. In 74 and 75, which I mentioned, the UN had special sessions on raw materials and industrial cooperation, which effectively gave countries the right to nationalize mineral resources. I think this is very much largely forgotten about now. The 1975 Lima Declaration established the United Nations Industrial Development Organization as a permanent specialist UN body. So the key components of the New International Economic Order were that it should bring about structural change in the world economy and also strengthen the collective self-reliance on the part of developing countries. It was an assertion of the power of producer countries in the world economy, where few countries produce the same commodity. It was an attempt to build solidary relations between them in order to amplify and organize this structural bargaining power. And it was seen as the main issues in the so-called North-South dialogue concept, and also the main sticking point in such a dialogue. In general terms, the capitalist bloc were reluctant but went along with proposals to avoid a major breakdown of relations. The socialist bloc was supportive of the concept, but were also the New International Economic Order, but were also critical of the concept of North-South dialogue because they said it didn't distinguish between capitalists and socialists in the North. The two major programs of the New International Economic Order were called the Integrated Program for Commodities and the Common Fund for Commodities, and also thematic areas based around the industrial processing of the commodities and the international economic cooperation around them. So the Integrated Program of Commodities, this was launched in 1974 with an idea of establishing a more stable price regime for international commodity trade through a network of different sectoral commodity agreements. Included two aspects, both the individual commodity agreements and a common fund for commodities. So it was quite wide-ranging. It included 18 commodities: bananas, bauxite, cocoa, coffee, copper, cotton and cotton yarns, hard fibers, products, iron ore, jute, manganese, meat, phosphate, rubber, sugar, it is there eventually, tea, tropical timber, tin, and vegetable oils. And there was also provision to add other commodities later. And the UNCTAD estimated there were 10 raw materials where it was viable to create international stocks, i.e. they were not perishable. These were to be negotiated case by case for specific agreements around these commodities, but in an integrated single process on commodities in general. It also included structural support for structural aspects such as marketing, distribution, transportation, and processing of commodities within this program. However, this program was set with many problems and delays, not least because it really heavily depended on the Common Fund, but the Common Fund itself had a lot of delays and problems with its negotiation process. So by 1979, only a rubber agreement existed. There were already tin, cocoa, coffee, and sugar agreements, and wheat and oil from before the program was launched, but it was very hard to actually launch new agreements under the program. It had two phases. The first phase of negotiations were opened when there was a more left-wing political environment, but the second phase, by the end of negotiations, it shifted much more to the right. Rise of economic crisis, and the whole process was under quite heavy attack. So this program developed in a much weaker way than originally envisioned, but it was still seen as a major international evolution of commodity policy. It gives international recognition of the importance of strong and stable commodity markets. It recognizes the need to view the problems of individual commodities within a broader framework of policies and principles and in the perspective of the importance of the commodity issue. It also highlights the importance of the developing countries and indeed the global economy. And it endorses the use of multiple instruments for intervening rather than leaving the market to just function on its own. So the other part of the new international economic order was the Common Fund for Commodities. The idea of this was it was a very powerful fund with large resources that were mainly controlled by developing countries that could intervene in commodity markets in order to purchase stockpiles and for compensatory funding in the face of low prices or weak market demand. The original idea was that the developing countries would have a major decisive voice in it, unlike their lack of voice in the other financial institutions, and that this would also give unprecedented powers of intervention. It was originally proposed as being self-funded by developing countries, including significant financial contributions from OPEC using their oil revenues. And it was not seen, this is really crucial, it was not seen as an aid fund, but as a fund to develop the collective economic power of developing countries. A second window included aid to support sectoral development in key commodities, but the main thing was not considered as aid. And this fund was the very, very big sticking point on the North-South issue. It was seen as a test of whether the so-called North was actually sincere in its intentions or whether it really didn't want to restructure the world economy or not. And it was hoped to be the first of many concrete agreements in the new international economic order. Consequently, it was a very difficult and conflictive process. Many compromises were made in the final outcome, and there were actual breakdowns of negotiation. The question of funding became very difficult, even though it was meant to be a developing country funded initiative. It was hard to raise the funds. Developed countries substantially preferred to deal with commodities on a case-by-case basis rather than in an overarching way, and that was the whole point in this program, is it dealt with it in an overarching way rather than case-by-case. And there was opposition to the Common Fund. Socialist countries did favour the integrated approach, but were less keen on the idea of a fund and viewed it as too market-based. At the same time, the developing countries made the establishment of a common fund a precondition, and in 1976 and 77, the UNCTAD meetings broke down. The African countries walked out, and the discussions were only resumed in 1978. This was such a big initiative, it was also discussed in many other international forums, such as, for instance, the Commonwealth had many substantial meetings on it in 77 and 78, and had a working group. Its outcome was less than desired, but still considered very important. It was finally signed in 1982, having been first proposed in, I think, 1974. According to Korea, it was the glittering prize of the new international economic order. This is despite the compromises that came. But the ratification process was extremely difficult. It only entered into force in June in 1989, 7 years after the signing of the agreement. So it arose in a period of global political and economic change. 1981 was world recession and collapse of global commodity prices, a shift to the right wing politically, Reagan, Thatcher, the weakening of the non-aligned movement, the weakening of the socialist bloc, the beginnings of neoliberalism. So other commodity arrangements were collapsing in this period. And so these were fundamentally different conditions from when the Common Fund had been conceived. And similarly, the International Sugar Organization came into existence just as the world landscape was becoming quite hostile. The Common Fund was dependent on the existence of sectoral international commodity agreements and less powerful to be able to intervene in a sector that does not already have such an agreement. However, as mentioned in the other slide, there were problems developing these sectoral agreements. So you get a chicken and egg. They became too dependent on national political wills rather than subordinating these political wills into the agreement. The funding was much less than anticipated and also did not substantially change the material power relations between developed and developing countries. The original fund was designed to stabilize the world economy as a whole, not just individual sectors, but the sectors, the commodity agreements are more for specific sectors. So this raises the tension between particular and universal interests. Finally, on the question of voting rights, developing countries do have more voting rights than in other financial institutions, but this is often watered down because of attempts to either use consensus or two-thirds majority decision. However, it's considered important that this institution is in place because, as we've heard in this conference, the question of commodities and sugar raises and falls over time. So it's very likely in the future, commodity question will become more important again, and the infrastructure will be in place at that point when it is needed. Meanwhile, sort of on the ground in particular countries during this period of the 70s, especially the 60s, 70s, you see nationalizations of the sugar sector in many countries, also cooperatives established, with the idea both to give more control of the sector, to improve social conditions in the sector, and to orientate the sector more closely with the wider goals of national development. In some cases, the goals were explicitly socialist, at other times, national development orientated. There was also important worker struggle and trade union activity. We've just heard about the question in Argentina, there's also in the Philippines, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Brazil, Colombia, Mauritius, and several others. And there were important efforts at internationalizing the struggle of sugar workers with an international commission for coordination of solidarity among sugar workers and several important international meetings of sugar workers in Trinidad and Tobago in 1977 and in Toronto in 1983. Many of these sugar unions were affiliated to the World Trade Federation of Trade Unions, the union federation associated with the Socialist Bloc. There were also often attempts to link sugar workers to struggles of other central economic sectors, such as oil workers in Trinidad and Tobago or the bauxite workers in Guyana. And capital and state in these countries were extremely afraid of such unity and attempted to break it, often with very tough repressive measures. Meanwhile, at the level of the sugar agreements in the 1970s, there was important revisions going on to these agreements. There was renegotiation of the International Sugar Agreement, the EEC and Commonwealth negotiations around the expiring in 1974 of the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, and in 1974 the US Sugar Act was under review. There were major world sugar shortages predicted by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization as early as 71, saying that by the 80s there'd be sugar shortages. Actually, there were sugar shortages by the mid-70s, and market prices became very high. The EC began building up a surplus of beet, and by 85 there was a very big surplus, which forced down world market prices. As exporting countries had to rely on low world market prices, it became harder for them to service their debts, e.g. in the Philippines and Brazil, so this also contributed to the global debt crisis. The real threat to the cane-producing developing countries came from the European Economic Community's efforts to flood the world market with sugar beet, which effectively contributed to the breakdown of the International Sugar Agreement. Interestingly, international solidarity in the North developed around defending cane producers at this time. There were several organizations in the UK and perhaps in other countries, I'm not aware of it, that were very specifically focused on this question in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So 1980s and 1980s, you have a major rollback. You have a commodities crisis, loss of export earnings, and debt crisis. But you also have the World Bank and International Monetary Fund implementing very strict structural adjustment programs. Much of this included encouraging export of crops, and many countries were encouraged to produce the same crops, which flooded the market and made world prices collapse. Also, state interventions such as national marketing boards were broken down, often privatization, devaluing of currencies, which all contributed to the weakening of these commodity politics. Finally, in 1994 was a major blow, the World Trade Organization, which opened up the world market and was effectively very much geared against protective arrangements. So the Common Fund or the special arrangements such as LOME were seen as discriminatory trade practices. In parallel, there was a weakening of UNCTAD, UNIDO, the non-aligned movement, the taming of the OPEC countries, and over time, the weakening and eventual breakdown completely and collapse of the Soviet bloc. Importantly, the processes of economic globalization put the different countries and workers within them in direct competition with each other. And you see a major consolidation in the sector, major rise of sugar transnational corporations, and much harder for small producers to function in that environment. You also see an intensified move away from sugar and towards substitutes, especially in the US, with high fructose corn syrup from the 1980s onwards. In many ways, this is almost like a reverse of the import substitution industrialization that developing countries themselves had used to increase their power and self-reliance in the world economy. You also see the question of the shift to bioethanol production, which actually started from sugar-producing countries trying to develop alternative uses for sugar to protect their interests, but very quickly became a capitalist development of bioethanols and creates its own problems such as worker conflict, land displacement, competing with food production, and in many ways is far from an ecological alternative. So what the International Sugar Organization is now is a very small organization based in London. It has 9 staff, and it is overseeing the implementation of the 1992 Sugar Agreement and the International Sugar Organization, which replaced the International Sugar Council. However, since 1984, it really lacks economic measures and does not make interventions around price setting or export quotas, but rather is about just promoting general cooperation, sharing information, gathering publications and research on sugar and sugar-related processes. So what we've seen throughout the development of this history is that basically several lines of conflict have been central. There's the general lines of conflict between different imperialisms, imperial country and colonial periphery, worker and capital, state and cooperative and private sector, plantation and small firm, and beet versus cane. There's also the tension between reforming and abolishing sugar following political independence, and the tension between monocrop and attempts to diversity. There's a struggle between guaranteed prices and supply based on long-term contracts and market-based competition, and a tension between solidarity among sugar producers or competition between them. Britain, France, Holland, and the USA substantially encouraged and protected cane producers to produce cane in order to secure their supplies, and then at the same time, when it no longer needed them, it spat them out onto the world market. Then you have an accelerating of the tension of beet and cane, which we've heard quite a lot in this conference already. There were major limits to these efforts. On the one hand, the UNCTAD proposals still operated within the market and were fundamentally about improved market operating rather than abolishing capitalist market relations. There were attempts at market planning based on planned division of labor at a global level, price fixing and determining production and consumption in advance so that markets were stable and predictable. In many ways, a form of global Keynesianism for planning supply and demand and for averting sectoral crisis. Importantly, all of these processes, national liberation struggles, socialism, socialist division of labor, were certain efforts. They had their own contradictions, new abuses and exploitation of workers, and propaganda frequently overemphasized successes and downplayed failures. These, of course, were also felt in the sugar sector, as in other sectors. Many of the gains were short-lived as capital made efforts to roll back the gains, often through shifting location of suppliers and finding substitutes. Despite these limits, this does not belittle the historical importance of these experiences and the need to reflect on them today. In fact, it is important to study precisely in order to understand these limitations and to overcome them in the future. The key aspect of sugar, though, and of other commodities, is the fact that it is a commodity and exists as a commodity in shaping the world division of labor. While commodity might not be the defining feature of capitalist world economy, its existence is certainly one of the key features of capitalism. As such, it's important to also return to some of the key intellectual theorists around commodities and commodity production. These are a few listed, but there are many more. Marx, Amir Amin, Argiri Emanuel about unequal exchange, Emmanuel Wallerstein on world systems, Isaac Rubin also on the commodity form, and Harry Cleaver on the commodity form. As with other global class struggles and commodity production, it's a continually evolving process. So too, the global history of sugar is an unfinished one. Undoubtedly, the world's sugar sector will evolve in years ahead, and this will continue to be shaped by class struggle. As wages in consumer countries go down, sugar consumption may well increase, as this is a cheap source of energy for maintaining workforces, so sugar demand will go up. This could mean that worker and national bargaining power of sugar-producing countries will strengthen once again. However, so too will their exploitation and subordination in the world economy. The issue becomes the question of how cheap or how expensive it is to produce the workforce. If the workforce reproduction can be reduced in cost, this means an increased proportion can be devoted for private profit, for capital. So this sugar is not just any old crop. Sugar is very key because it's a very cheap way of reproducing the labor force. Areas that I didn't really have a chance to look at, but I think would be important, and I think linked closely also to Ferencz's graph of the price, sugar price over time, is what was the driver of price changes? What was the driver of international sugar arrangements, either holding out or breaking up? I suspect this is very closely linked to the question of worker struggles in the sugar sector, but I haven't really looked into this yet. As with all agreements, agreements are an outcome of different political and economic forces, and different levels of organization and unity of different actors, as so too are the prices. I'd like to end with this other quote that also, I think, sums up quite nicely the contradictory nature of sugar. The cane is a contradiction, a friend and a foe. This comes from 1967 sugar harvest in Cuba. The cane is a contradiction, a friend and a foe. The cutters enroll themselves voluntarily. Every stalk cut increases the country's wealth. That we know, there is no question about it. But the cane one cuts with hatred. A battle begins between brigade and CARNEVALE. The cane grows and grows, twists around its own roots, resists, advances kilometers. It is a battle complete with casualties, the dropouts, heroes and victorious brigades. But we don't think about any of that in the cane field, where arms ache from cutting and the cane never ends, and where one cane falls but another and still another stands waiting for you, and you have to bend before her to fell her. At times she hides among other cane or gets lost under the fallen cane husk, and you have to drag her out of there. All of this under a sun that wraps you in heat and makes the earth vibrate. The occasional wafts of breeze are few and far between, and never enough, never quite enough to fill the lungs. The second day is decisive. Whoever stays in the cane after the second day can last the whole harvest. Every pane on earth blooms the second day. And here are some institutional web links of the major international institutions in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, KOLYA, for your extensive presentation and research. Maybe there's some questions in the crowd. So the comment is we need to digest first, but maybe you.
Yeah, KOLYA, thanks a lot. You said that you are not a specialist, but you are. We are. It was really great. Thank you very much, and especially that you gave us like a lot of material to keep on working, to keep on researching. And so I really hope that very soon we start to work on other, like diagrams, graphics, all these agreements. Actually, that's why we were talking with the participants of this first Eastern Sugar Program to continue the work, because we knew that there are a lot of things to research. So thanks a lot. It was really very inspiring, and I just made, I don't know, like how many pages of, dates and names and all these organizations. So thanks a lot. These were exactly the missing points from the first research program.
Thank you. No, I've enjoyed very much putting this presentation together, because it pulled together different strands of work that I had done in the past in a more focused way. So I enjoyed it a lot, and I would very much enjoy being part of ongoing processes with you, discussing all of this further.
Nice. Yeah?
Hello, KOLYA. Just one more question. I know that you have said that you have done research on the 20th century sugar relations, but in some sense, maybe you can give us just from your understanding, from what you have researched, and also from some things that you have said in the presentation. So, for instance, the European Economic Community's intention to flood the world market with beet sugar, and the fact that this was really a threat to cane sugar. And in relation to today's Ilona's presentation, I was wondering, I mean, I was reading when preparing for the conference, I was reading a little bit on basically Ilona's work and maybe extended a bit, and saw that the World Trade Organization requested to remove protections and introduce quotas to the EU exports, if I understand correctly. And I wonder if you know which global actors are now pushing for this, just to have an understanding.
I haven't followed too much the developments in the last sort of 15 to 20 years. The World Trade Organization was very, very key in the global landscape of trade. It basically extended all the existing trade arrangements through the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs to mean it was very, very hard to not be part of it. So more and more countries joined. That was also part of what followed the breakup of the socialist countries, was them rapidly joining the World Trade Organization. And a key part of the World Trade Organization is the question of non-discrimination and most favored nation status, which basically means you have to put all your trade partners on an equal footing. So what it means is you get strong and weak economies basically producing and trading in the same forum. So you have completely unequal terms of exchange. It provoked a very big movement of agricultural organizations around the world. The Via Campesina is a global network of peasant farmers that specifically emerged around the World Trade Organization. I haven't followed sort of too much, but there's many regional trade organizations developing trade agreements. There was a big round in the 90s, early 2000s, such as the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. There's a new host of trade agreements developing in the last few years. So agricultural trade will be a very key part of it. Now the trade is also very, the question of e-commerce is essential. So you're getting the whole interaction between e-commerce and agricultural trade. Another key part of the World Trade Organization was you get the interaction between agricultural trade and intellectual property rights. So you have the rise of the agricultural transnational company that also involves the question of patents and seed varieties. So all of this sort of makes it harder. It basically makes it harder for any state or international regulation of a sector that's based on cooperation and solidarity, because instead it basically emphasizes competition at every angle. So it's a competition between countries, between companies, and between workers in the sectors. So a big part of why a company closes down, what Ilona was talking about, is basically it's deemed uncompetitive. The state structure is deemed uncompetitive, it's privatized, then it's closed down completely, because the company that's privatized it owns other assets and doesn't need that one. I mean, I don't know the details of what Ilona was talking about. It's a new story to me, but it seems it fits very well in that landscape.
Okay, perhaps there's another question. Okay, if there are no more questions, maybe then this is a moment to close our second day, maybe you want to say a couple of words?
Yeah, just a short thank you to everybody who was talking today. Thank you, KOLYA. Thank you, Graciela. Thank you, Ilona. Thank you, yesterday's speakers, Dale, Ferenc, Margareta, and Anton, or Anton who was speaking, Catherine Baker, and that's it. Thank you, Drugo More, for having us and for giving us the opportunity to prepare this event, and thank you, the audiences online and here. I think we can close the discursive program now of Moje, tvoje, naše, mine, yours, ours, and the exhibition will stay open until the end of April, so I guess you're invited very much to come and see it. Thank you.